Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you for inviting me. I'll be rattling through an awful lot of slides very, very quickly now, so if your eyes glaze over, don't worry about it. Just like some pieces of music stick in your head and go round and round your head for weeks on end, some images do as well, and this is one that's been rattling around my head for the past few months. And I've been trying to figure out for the very strong lady that it shows here, is her look one of accusation or is it one of fierce independence? But certainly I think we can agree it's one of saying, well, I'm shouldering an enormous burden. Quite clearly, I'm tackling a lot of things at the same time. And this bothered me so much, I began to ask myself, well, what kind of situation are we responsible for this particular individual? So I went to Zambia a few weeks ago and Malawi and asked local people about their experience of trying to cope with the burden of life that they have. And, when you go into a small community hall or church and you find people sitting and talking to you about their problems, the oldest person there always has the longest memory. And the longest memory of this old man here told me, well, we're having all sorts of problems with our harvest. The rains are coming 3 weeks late. If we plant our seeds at the normal time, they shrivel up. The harvest again, the rains retreat a few weeks early, and so our crop dies in the field quite often as well. Acute problems. And the unspoken question, of course, why is this happening? Who's responsible for it? And that's the scientific question, I think, that we have to address, bearing in mind the fact that we should be people as scientists who respond to what people on the ground need and think. I went a little further on that voyage up to Victoria Falls, the famous Victoria Falls, where the Zambezi tumbles over this huge escarpment and flows into the largest man-made reservoir on Earth at Kariba, which supplies over 90% of the power supply for Zambia. I took a photograph of it 6 weeks ago. This is the photograph from June of last year. This is the photograph 6 weeks ago. And it's quite striking, I think, what the difference is between the two. This is what climate change means on the ground. It means if you're relying on hydropower in that populous nation, you have, at the moment, 18 hours of power cuts every day. Trying to cope with that in the cities, trying to cope with that in the countryside is extremely difficult, as you'll appreciate. It also has implications for the fact that you still have to eat. You can get by without electricity for heat and for cooling, but you can't necessarily get by without food. So you have to rely on the charcoal sellers, who in turn then go out and deforest the landscape. The urban dwellers come and wheel off anything they can to power their own charcoal burners. And the life of the people in the countryside, just like that young woman a few moments ago, gets even more difficult in that situation. Who is responsible? Well, we know that a lot of what's been happening there has been happening elsewhere in the world, and we know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have established that from the millions of observations around the world, the globe has warmed by just under a degree in the past century, but rapidly in the past 30 years. We know that that trend is fairly well established. And despite that, of course, you will find contrarian voices and sceptical voices who try and cherry-pick the trend, maybe starting at the very end of the 1990s. But you can do that with any trend, and you'll always find a way of finding a contrary trend if you cherry-pick parts of the data. But the evidence is really quite astounding when you look at the overall trend of climate, and that's the important thing to stress. We know that it's people that are responsible, because when you feed in all of the natural forces that change climate, things like solar activity, things like volcanic activity, they don't have a measurable forcing effect. When you feed in the anthropogenic elements, the elements of greenhouse gases, even negated by the extra particle pollution in the atmosphere to some extent, then you get a match with what's been happening in terms of global temperature. And when we feed all of those into our climate models, we can get a handle, therefore, on what the future holds. We drive them, of course, with the emissions scenarios for how much greenhouse gas emissions we're putting into the atmosphere. And you can see here we're putting about 10,000 million tonnes into the atmosphere of carbon every year. On a business-as-usual trajectory, that takes us up to about 15 or 16 within the next 20 years. That's the business as usual scenario which the IPCC have said will now, if we continue it, lead us to a potential warming of 4 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, a 50-50 chance of if we stay on that business as usual trajectory. It also, of course, means that we have all sorts of problems in terms of changes in extremes, and we have all sorts of problems in terms of a further rise in temperature in the short term. And of course, for our friends in the developing world, it's not temperature that's crucial, it's rainfall. And we know from the same models that it's likely that the places that are already deficient in rainfall will become more deficient, and the places which have already too much rainfall are likely to get even more. In a warmer world, of course, the atmosphere can hold more water vapour. So we have the science fairly well established, and indeed we don't even need to establish it because nature is already telling us the same story. We know from looking at the way in which the polar regions are changing, where large amounts of, I think about 215,000 million tonnes of ice are being added as water to the global ocean every year from Greenland, and about 150,000 million tonnes now coming from Antarctica, a place we thought was stable as recently as 10 years ago. All of that adding to the problem of sea level rise, all of it adding to the potential problem of changes in storm tracks. And of course, the other aspect, which is quite clear-cut, is the decline of the summer sea ice. You could, for example, this year, as you can see, sail from the English Channel coast of France all the way around through the north coast of Siberia, all the way around to China and Japan without encountering any ice at all. You could also sail around the Northwest Passage, the fabled Northwest Passage, round Alaska to California from Europe without encountering any ice at all. Very changed days from the days of the past where explorers spent their lives trying to find the fabled Northwest Passage. Here you can see one explorer, his statue is in London, who eventually perished trying to find that passage. And Sir John Franklin's expedition, as we now know, ended up in cannibalism. Such were the hardships that they endured. We now know that that Northwest Passage is open most years, and the scramble for trade routes, the scramble for saving money is now underway. You can save $300,000 by using the Northeast Passage rather than sailing around the Cape of Good Hope to Asia. So it's a new zone, a contested zone emerging, which is going to be crucial. The science is also very clear on where the vulnerabilities lie in terms of areas, in terms of ecosystems. The sub-Saharan zone of Africa we know well from the various problems we've seen there in terms of the Sahel, in terms of the Horn of Africa in recent years. We know also the problems of the small island states where many thousands of people live within a metre of sea level and where they face the extinction of their culture through no fault of their own. We know also that the other major region of concern are the great deltas of the world, where subsidence from the weight of sediment the rivers are bringing down telescopes climate change impacts into a much shorter period. This is the best known, Bangladesh. Here's Ireland for scale. It's about twice, maybe 3 times the size of Ireland. And on the island of Ireland, we have it currently 6 million people. In that zone of Bangladesh, we have 160. So here's where the problems are really going to be acute. And as the previous speaker said, even a 1 metre rise in sea level here will displace people because there is simply nowhere else for them to go in that crowded country. And you can begin to appreciate why the European migrant crisis may well be simply a small-scale harbinger of worse things to come. Indeed, we're seeing some worse things in the developing countries. We're seeing the rate of extremes increasing substantially. Typhoon Haiyan here. We're seeing even developed cities in the most populated, not the most populated, but the most prosperous country in the world being largely devastated by extreme events, events which sometimes we forget about very quickly indeed. And of course, we tend to think of climate change as something not happening here, happening in developing countries, happening in the outside world. But we know for places like Ireland and indeed France in the middle latitudes, their changes will be very much along the global average lines. And for anywhere in Ireland you go, it is now 0.5 degree warmer than it was 30 years ago. And that's quite a substantial change. It may not sound very much, but it changes growing season, it changes the frequency of extremes very considerably. And from our modelling work in Maynooth, we know that those kinds of changes will increase in the years ahead, with another 1 degree, most likely, over the next 30 years. So we're on the way to the kind of changes predicted by global models. And those changes are not always crucial in terms of temperature. For Ireland, for example, you can see the blue here indicates drier summers in the east, and the red indicates substantially wetter winters in the west in the years ahead. And when we feed those kinds of model outputs into, say, streamflow models, then we get all sorts of changes happening in terms of flood frequency, in terms of drought frequency. Not marked very much, as you can see here, for the Boyne in the 2020s, but as you work your way through the century, you can see the emergent flood problem, you can see the emergent summer dryness problem becoming more and more severe. So the kind of scenes that we've become familiar with in Ireland in winter, likely to become more common, likely to become more frequent, likely to become more severe as a result of these changes occurring, even affecting, as we know, some of our major cities in extreme events. And of course, let's not forget the problem of drier summers and the problem of investing in infrastructure and tackling the risks and fixing the leaks. We can model as to how much time we can buy by each of those by using the climate data and the climate science that we have. Let's not forget that the kind of extreme events that we think were a blip are likely also to recur. And in the case of agriculture, 500 million for the very cold spring a few years ago. What if we had 300,000 more dairy cows to cope with? How much more does that make the problem accelerate? Of course, we all know about the winters a couple of years ago when all of the probabilities went the wrong way. When the storm arrived at the same time as the storm surge, at the same time as the high tide was in, then we get the kind of issues of flooding, the issues of storm damage to a higher level in different coastal zones which were not previously attacked, becoming more severe as time goes on. We know also about the habitats and landscapes that are going to be threatened, the habitats that maybe we take for granted as part of our psyche, as part of our cultural endowment even in Ireland. We don't look after some of them very well, of course. We don't have the leadership to actually protect those valuable carbon stores the way we should. But also the species, the things which are close to their southern limit in Europe, especially in Ireland. Species like the salmon, species like the Arctic char, obviously, will be very early casualties of warming. And also, at the same time, other species will fill those niches, sometimes unwelcome species, here giant rhubarb or gunnera invading the island of Achill, as you can see on the bottom right. And we can model as to where those kinds of species will become established and how severe the problem will be. A particular issue that we've been looking at in Maynooth for the past few years has been forest pests. Your pensions are dependent on forests being viable in 60 years' time. They're being planted today. What will they be like in 60 years' time? Will the climate be suitable for growing trees? Will there be new pests emerging which will attack them? This is a particularly interesting one, the horse chestnut leaf miner. The eradication rate is 2% because it mines its way into chestnut leaves, who fall very early on. If you look at the little black dot at Macedonia here, that's where it was first identified, way back in the 1980s. And since that time, it's made its way through Europe. It crossed the Channel about the turn of the century. It has made its way through England in the past 10 years. And 2 years ago, it was at Holyhead, waiting for the boat. It made the boat eventually, and it's now beginning to occur in Eastern Ireland. And these are the kinds of things we have to grapple with, the consequences of change. Economically, we have to grapple with infrastructural decisions that will have to be made. When will we move this railway? How safe is it to build it 20 yards back, 30 yards back? We don't want to pass on a legacy of bad decisions to the next generation, which will be very costly indeed to remedy. We can use very powerful tools now to identify where and when flood events are likely to be severe. We can use GPS and we can use postcodes even to identify who will be at risk. And for even Dublin Bay here, you can see we can identify all the addresses below certain heights. And we can do this for any county in Ireland. And we can say, well, what if a flood occurs like 2009? How much would the insurance claims be per household? And when we do that, we can work out very quickly that we're looking at over $1 billion for even a modest coastal flood in many parts of Ireland. So the cost of inaction, the cost of doing nothing, which is often not calculated, it's often not thought about, the cost of doing nothing dwarfs the cost of remedial action, the cost of adaptation, the cost of prevention. So Ban Ki-moon was right when he came to Dublin earlier this year, and he said, we are the last generation that can tackle this problem, because we are. If we don't tackle it, the next generation will not have the option available to them. Who are the culprits? To go back to the problem, who's responsible? You can see at first sight here, the large-scale culprits are mainly in North America, in Europe, in China, and India. And just compare the outputs there in terms of the area of those countries. Compare the outputs. Have I lost something? Maybe I've pushed the wrong button. If you just compare the outputs, yeah, I'll keep going. Okay, just to compare the outputs with, say, sub-Saharan Africa, which is negligible in terms of its contribution to those stories. Okay, so I'm on my last 3 minutes, so I'll go even quicker. Some countries are beginning to react very favorably. Europe, for example, has taken a very strong leadership role in this area with the European roadmap. And indeed, some countries, as part of that, have been very proactive and made great progress. The UK's climate change bill is actually an exemplary bill. Even within the UK, the devolved administrations are even going further. But when you look down that table at the per capita output in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, you can see who the real culprits are. And Ireland is one of the worst culprits on a per capita basis in the world. Largely because we have both an industrial and an agricultural sector. So we're going the wrong way. Our greenhouse gas emissions are increasing again as the recession ceases and will, within the next couple of years, exceed the EU annual limit totals. That's largely because of an increase in agricultural emissions, largely because we're intensifying agriculture by huge increases in milk output, planned 50% increases to make advantages or to exploit advantages from the withdrawal of the milk levy. But it means that we're going in the opposite direction to where we should be going. And if you ask the question, where are we going to be in 2050? Well, the climate change bill says clearly there are going to be no fossil fuel-based energy sources in Ireland. There are going to be no fossil fuel-based transport sources in Ireland. There are going to be no fossil fuel-based sources in your homes in Ireland. Where are all our emissions going to be? All of them are going to be allocated to one sector. And that's a very important issue in terms of climate justice. So my second last theme, Flora will permit me, second last theme is just to say, be very careful when you hear the rhetoric about COP21, because there is a diversity at work here. There's a dual system of communication. One is the kind of thing that people want to hear, and our politicians are very good at saying the clock is ticking, time is running out, we have to tackle this major problem. But there's also the second one, the vested interests, the powerful vested interests at work. And you can see on the right-hand side here, statements made shortly after the statement on the left was made, which really illustrates the true response to local power groups. And of course, that's demonstrated very well when you put your hand in your pocket and don't offer very much to the developing countries for the Green Climate Fund, but that's another issue I haven't time to look at. The last point I want to make is simply a science point, and it's the most important science point of the fifth assessment report, because here you have a very strong relationship between the amount of warming that the Earth has had, about 1 degree, and the cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide. A strong linear relationship which you can then extend and say, well, if we want to avoid a certain value, how much do we have to burn? And our quota is 790 billion tons of carbon. Once we exceed that, we face dangerous climate change. There's no way back. It's like the home store in Morad in Ireland. Once it's gone, it's gone. And that's the kind of message that we have to get across. Unfortunately, we've burned about 545 billion tonnes already, so we only have 245 billion tonnes left to play with for all our future generations, for the next century, effectively. And we're burning about 11 of those every, 11 billion tonnes of those every year. So the imperative is clear. The window is closing. We have a very short time span to get our act together, and that's why Paris is so vital. That's why it's so important, because that's why we really have to decide what is the message that we're going to send to this lady about what Europe, about what Ireland is actually going to do on the ground, as opposed to rhetoric in terms of addressing her particular problem. Thank you.